Okay, I think we're live. Just want to do a short video because I think David Wood is streaming in about 12 minutes. So just want to do a very short video addressing the quote unquote Muslim ban and the extension of the Muslim ban, which is not really a Muslim ban. Both parts of it are incorrect. And I remember a bunch of these armchair policy and immigration analysts getting on social media and attacking this Muslim ban. First of all, two of the countries, Tanzania and Burma, are not Muslim countries. They have minority Muslim populations. The Rohingya in Burma and in Tanzania, Zanzibar is predominantly Muslim, but Tanzania is a Christian country, and Burma is predominantly Buddhist. In fact, there was a concerted effort by the media to portray racist, xenophobic Buddhist hate preachers, and they neglected to mention the fact that there have been jihadist attacks within Burma for over a decade, particularly in the south, in places like Rakhine State. There are attacks on Buddhists and Muslim attacks on army installations and elsewhere. So it wasn't as if this was a one-sided pogrom launched against Muslims. Oh, that's weird. I'll have to take a look at that. But I agree. You should pray for our leaders, even ones that are not you're not particularly enamored of. But going back to that, but they also don't provide any sort of background to Burma. The fact that the Rohingya were actually migrants, um, like servants who followed the British and were used as kind of a servant class within Burma. But the media is constantly misrepresenting these things. So those two countries, they're not Muslim countries, but also the ban itself is not quite a ban. It's simply a precautionary measure because these countries have dangerous people in them. For example, Nigeria, the underwear bomber Mutalib was Nigerian, and in fact, his father came into an American consulate and warned them about his son. But for some reason, this didn't attract the attention of the government, and there were legitimate reasons for placing Nigeria on this list. The fact that Nigeria is a security threat, and Nigerians themselves admit it. There was a great post on Powerline blog, which was quoting from an article which demonstrated that Nigerians themselves were not necessarily in favor of the ban, but they agreed with President Trump's statements about Nigeria itself, that they did present a security threat. And in fact, Nigeria is one of the countries where President Trump has majority support. And I think one of the reasons is because he recognizes that there's a legitimate threat, and no one recognizes this more than the people who actually have to live in Nigeria. Their president Muhammad Buhari is a Muslim, and usually in Nigeria you have these presidents who are Muslim from the north of the country, and he's allowed Boko Haram to run rampant all over the entire country, to kidnap little girls, to attack and kill with abandon. And the government keeps saying that they've crushed Boko Haram, but you have to look at the way they've treated the Christians in that country and the way they've treated the Muslims. By contrast, the Fulani, they're described as Fulani tribesmen, but they're really jihadists in a lot of cases. So the idea that you should just allow these people to enter the United States with no vetting, with no sort of, and that you shouldn't punish a country whose government is allowing its Christian population to be massacred, and their goal is to wipe out wipe out the remaining Christians in that country. The idea that you shouldn't punish that country in some way is absurd. And beyond that, the idea that certain countries should have open access to America because regardless of whether the people from these countries are overstaying their visas, whether they pose a security threat, this idea that these countries, simply because of their large population, and Nigeria is the most populous country in the continent of Africa, but the idea that they should have access to America is simply because they have a large population is ridiculous. This is the same justification that's used for these H-1B visas being granted to India. And there's a huge lobbying effort now by corporations, particularly tech companies, and their proxies in the US Senate, particularly, to extend and expand on the amount of visas being given to India for jobs where we have thousands and tens of thousands of qualified American applicants. And it's simply an excuse to outsource and kind of remove this group of this vocation from Americans. And it's really just bizarre, this idea that because there are a lot of people in a country, that they should have a demand, that they should be able to demand visas or have open access to America, regardless of how the people there have comported themselves, like whether they've overstayed their visas, regardless of whether or not they're law abiding or pose a security threat. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, when you use this attitude, you get things like Ilhan Omar as a congressperson. It just doesn't make any sense. And furthermore, the idea that the Muslim ban is a threat to national security is simply absurd, especially when you look at all of the refugees from Islamic countries that have gone on to commit terrorism and commit jihad. Michelle Malkin has a great book, Open Borders Inc., newly published, which has a list. There's an appendix at the back of the book that lists every single refugee from an Islamic country, and the majority of them are either from Somalia, from Bosnia, or Iraq, with the occasional Palestinian refugee. And she lists all of the attacks or acts of terrorism that they committed. And that the list, it takes up about 10 pages. So it's 10 pages long. And this is just a brief, just like a brief sample. There are 5 or 6 dozen Somali refugees from Minnesota that were indicted or prosecuted for joining al-Shabaab. And I think this is something that you need to consider when you're thinking of issues like a Muslim ban. You have these people emoting. They don't use any sort of rational discourse or logic to explain why there shouldn't be a Muslim ban. They just say it's xenophobic or it's bigoted, but they don't provide any statistics or any sort of rational explanation for why this is a bad idea. And they certainly don't address all of the Muslim refugees, whether or not they came here under the Refugee Act or under other visas, but later applied for refugee status or political asylum. All of these people that went on to commit horrible acts of jihad. There was a police officer. There was an Iraqi refugee in Arizona who was just arrested. He was a member of ISIS and had murdered an Iraqi police officer in Fallujah, and it's taken years for them to even get him to even arrest him and to expedite the deportation proceedings. So you have people using fraud to pretend that they helped the American army and the armed forces, and then trying to milk a very sympathetic media to broadcast that story, and they're not telling you the real deal. Anyway, I just wanted to address that topic. It's I think it's a very important issue, but like I said, David Wood is going to begin streaming in a couple of minutes, so I want to make this video short. I'm going to go back to the Quran read through tomorrow, probably in the morning. But thanks everyone for dropping by, and like I said, feel free to share this video. Good night.